The stepmother's laughter rang through the courtyard like a whip, sharp and cutting, meant to pierce deeper than any blow could. Each morning, the girl would rise before the sun, her thin frame moving quietly through the house, carrying out the endless tasks that had been forced upon her. No matter how hard she worked, her stepmother always found reason to laugh. If she spilled a little water from the pot she carried, the stepmother would clap her hands and call for the neighbors, saying, "Look at this useless child, even water escapes her grasp." If she moved too slowly when sweeping, the stepmother would pretend to mimic her, dragging her feet and contorting her face in mock pity until the crowd of onlookers burst into cruel laughter. The girl had grown so used to being the center of ridicule that her cheeks no longer flushed. She simply lowered her gaze, holding her silence like armor. But silence, though a shield, was heavy to carry when the weight of laughter pressed from every side. The villagers were no better. At first, some only smiled uncomfortably when the stepmother mocked her, pretending not to hear, but over time they grew bold, emboldened by the cruelty that had been normalized. Old women at the well whispered that the girl must be cursed, otherwise why would her stepmother laugh at her so boldly? Young boys tossed stones in her path, laughing as she stumbled, while their mothers looked on without correction, joining in the smirks and jokes that cut into her spirit. Even those who once pitied her began to distance themselves, afraid of being mocked in her place. Slowly, the girl became a symbol of weakness, a canvas for their laughter, her humanity hidden behind the shadows of their amusement. Every day was another stage for the stepmother's cruelty. She found pleasure in inventing new humiliations. She once forced the girl to eat scraps from the floor while she and her children dined richly at the table, inviting the neighbors to watch and laugh as though it were some grand performance. Another time, she paraded the girl through the marketplace, dressed in torn rags and smeared with ashes, calling her the village shadow, while the merchants and buyers chuckled, some spitting at her feet. The girl, though burning with shame inside, did not speak. She endured, her silence deeper than the laughter that surrounded her, her suffering hidden within the folds of her heart. It was not only the laughter that cut into her, but the sound of joy itself turned sharp. Laughter that should have been filled with lightness became a weapon, a reminder that she was seen not as a person but as entertainment. Each mocking sound carved its mark into her soul. Yet, beneath the humiliation, a strange thing stirred within her. Though her heart ached, her spirit did not collapse. Each day she learned to let the sound of laughter pass over her like wind over stone, wearing her down but never breaking her completely. She found herself observing her tormentors more closely, noticing the false bravado behind their laughter, the unease in their eyes when they mocked too hard, the way even her stepmother's voice sometimes cracked when the cruelty reached its peak. The villagers thought their laughter had destroyed her. They thought they had reduced her to nothing more than an object of scorn. But inside, a quiet strength was growing. She began to notice that even though she was mocked, she had survived things that others never faced. She had endured hunger, shame, isolation, and loneliness without vanishing. She had felt the sting of cruelty so many times that her skin, though tender, had thickened with an unseen armor. And though her stepmother's laughter seemed victorious, it also betrayed something else. A desperate need to control, to dominate, to keep the girl beneath her. The girl sensed, even if she could not yet name it, that such desperate laughter hid a weakness, and that weakness might one day be revealed. The nights were the hardest, when silence fell and no laughter echoed through the village. Alone with her thoughts, the girl often wondered if she was indeed as worthless as they said. She replayed the mocking words in her head, hearing them again and again, the ridicule etched deep in her memory. Yet with every tear that rolled down her cheek in the darkness, something inside her refused to die. She did not know where it came from, perhaps from the memory of her mother, perhaps from an ancient strength that belonged to her bloodline, or perhaps from some power beyond the world of the living, but she clung to it, whispering to herself in the quiet of night that one day, things would not be the same. And so the laughter continued, day after day, mocking her pain and branding her as nothing. But in their cruelty they failed to see what was happening. They failed to see that with every laugh, every cruel jest, they were shaping her into something they would not recognize later. They thought they were breaking her, but they were only awakening her. For pain endured in silence becomes strength, and mockery endured without collapse becomes power. While they laughed, she was changing, and though they believed her powerless, her silence was only the beginning of something far greater than any of them could imagine. At night, when the village grew silent and even the stepmother's laughter faded into memory, the girl would retreat into the darkness of her small corner. It was there, away from mocking eyes, that her tears flowed freely. She never cried during the day, never gave her stepmother or the villagers the satisfaction of seeing her broken, But when the moonlight slipped through cracks in the walls, she let herself release the sorrow that pressed heavy on her chest. Each sob was muffled by her hands, hidden so no one would hear, because she knew that even her pain could be turned into another joke if discovered. Her tears were hot and endless, yet they carried more than grief. They carried the weight of humiliation, loneliness, and betrayal. At first, those tears felt like weakness. She often wondered why she could not stop them, why her body betrayed her with trembling shoulders and aching sobs when all she wanted was to be strong. But over time, something shifted. The more she cried, the more she realized that each tear cleansed her heart of the poison her stepmother poured into it. Each night of sorrow drained away despair, leaving behind not emptiness but something harder, sharper, something that would not break so easily again. Her tears, though born of pain, began to carve her spirit like a river cutting through stone. She started to notice that the sadness no longer consumed her for as long as it once did. When she wiped her face and stared at her reflection in the water bowl, she no longer saw only weakness. She began to see someone who had survived another day of mockery, another round of laughter, another storm of cruelty. The girl realized she was still here, still breathing, still standing where others might have collapsed. The very act of crying, of allowing herself to feel the weight of her suffering, became a quiet rebellion, because in those moments she claimed her humanity back from those who tried to strip it away. In the silence of her tears, her heart began to change. The softness that once made her vulnerable began to harden, not into bitterness but into resolve. She thought of her stepmother's cruel smile, of the villagers' laughter ringing in her ears, and instead of breaking down, she began to whisper to herself that it would not always be this way. Her sorrow turned into fuel, a hidden fire burning where no one could see. Every tear was no longer just grief, it was a seed of determination. By the time the moon set and morning light crept into the sky, her tears had dried, and with them dried pieces of her old self. What remained was a girl who, though outwardly silent and submissive, was quietly transforming inside. Her tears had hardened her, shaping her into someone who would no longer simply endure, but who was slowly, silently preparing for the day when she would rise. The night was chosen carefully by her stepmother, for cruelty tasted sweeter when it had an audience. The village gathered under the flickering light of torches for a small celebration, a feast of harvest and laughter, and the girl was dragged forward like a spectacle. Her stepmother's voice carried above the chatter, sharp and laced with malice, announcing to all that the child she despised was a warning to others, an example of failure, weakness, and shame. The villagers, already accustomed to mocking the girl in whispers, now found permission to laugh openly. They pointed at her ragged clothes, at her thin arms and hollow cheeks, and their laughter rose like a storm, louder than the drums that beat in the background. The girl stood frozen, her eyes wide and her throat tight. She felt the ground beneath her bare feet tremble as every gaze pierced her, as though she were being stripped of dignity piece by piece. Her stepmother pushed her to the ground, forcing her knees into the dirt, and poured ashes over her head as if marking her with disgrace. The crowd roared with delight, the sound blending into a chorus of cruelty that seemed to have no end. She could not fight back, not yet, and her silence only fed their amusement. In that moment, humiliation became a weapon, wielded not only by her stepmother but by every person who chose to laugh instead of turning away. As the ashes clung to her hair and face, she felt a coldness seep into her heart. Tears stung her eyes but would not fall, not here, not before them. Something in her refused to give them that victory. Instead, her sorrow sank deep into her chest, heavy and unyielding, pressing against her ribs like a caged fire. Every insult burned itself into her memory, every cruel word etched itself like a scar. For the first time, she no longer saw herself only as a victim of their cruelty. She began to see their laughter as weakness, their mockery as a veil for their own fear. Her stepmother, reveling in her dominance, raised her chin high and declared that the girl would never rise, never matter, never be anything more than a shadow in their midst. The crowd cheered, but beneath their noise the girl heard something else, something quieter, something darker. It was not the whispers of comfort she had felt in her solitude, but a stirring, a thrum of power beneath her skin, as though the humiliation itself was awakening a hidden part of her. She felt her hands tremble, not with fear but with a restless energy she could not yet understand. When the feast ended and the torches dimmed, the villagers returned to their homes, leaving her alone in the dirt with ashes clinging to her skin. The silence that followed was heavier than the laughter had been. She knelt there, shivering, her body aching, but her eyes had changed. The humiliation had shattered something soft within her, but in its place a hard edge was forming, sharp and unyielding. The night had broken her innocence, torn apart the fragile pieces of her hope, and in their ruins, something new began to rise. As she lifted her head to the dark sky, she felt the weight of their cruelty press down on her, but instead of crushing her, it became fuel. She whispered no words, made no vows aloud, but deep within her a promise was forged. The stepmother who laughed, the villagers who joined in, the world that had turned its back, none of them would ever laugh the same way again. What had been meant to destroy her had instead awakened a force that would not rest until it was answered. The night of humiliation was not her end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. The night after her humiliation stretched endlessly, the air thick with silence that pressed against her chest like a weight. She sat curled in a corner of the small hut where she was forced to sleep, her skin still streaked with the ashes her stepmother had thrown upon her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the villagers twisted in cruel laughter, their mouths open like wolves tearing at her spirit. She wanted to cry, to release the storm inside her, but her tears had dried, leaving only the ache of emptiness. It was in that emptiness that something else began to stir. At first it was faint, like a sigh carried by the wind. She thought she imagined it, some echo of her mind breaking beneath the weight of despair. But then it came again, low and deliberate, a murmur that brushed against her ears though no one else was near. Her heart pounded, and she pressed her palms over her ears trying to shut it out, but the whispers slipped through her skin, through her very blood. They spoke not in the voices of strangers but with tones that seemed older, voices that carried both pain and command. The whispers told her of things she had never heard, names buried long before her birth. They spoke of a bloodline marked by power too dangerous to be left untamed. Her ancestors, they said, had once walked with forces beyond human understanding, and from them had come a curse, not of weakness but of fire and shadow, meant to awaken only when suffering reached its peak. The curse was not punishment, it was inheritance. It slept within her veins, waiting for the moment she would no longer endure but rise. She shook her head, terrified. "No," she whispered to the empty air, her voice trembling. "I am nothing. I am weak." But the voices pressed closer, surrounding her, seeping into the marrow of her bones. "You are not weak. You are the vessel." They reminded her of every lash of her stepmother's tongue, every jeer from the villagers, every moment of hunger gnawing at her ribs. Each memory, they said, was not meant to break her but to sharpen her, to carve her into the shape of power. The curse was not born from kindness, it was forged in cruelty, fed by her pain and waiting for her command. Her hands shook violently as the whispers filled her mind. The hut around her seemed to darken, the corners stretching deeper than they should, shadows lengthening unnaturally. She could feel warmth rise in her chest, spreading through her veins like liquid fire. It was not the warmth of comfort but of raw, untamed energy, a promise of destruction. She clutched her stomach, gasping as though something inside her wanted to claw its way out. For the first time she realized she was not entirely alone. Something ancient, something bound to her, had been with her all along. She remembered the way the villagers had laughed, the way her stepmother's eyes glimmered with cruel triumph. That memory no longer made her only ache with sorrow, it ignited the whispers, made them stronger, clearer. "They fed us with their cruelty. Now feed on us, child. Let the curse breathe." The voices layered upon one another until they were like a chorus, steady and certain. She pressed her palms to the dirt floor and felt it pulse beneath her fingers, as if the earth itself listened. Fear warred with fascination inside her. Could she resist them? Should she? She wanted to believe she was still just a girl, ordinary and powerless, but the truth felt undeniable. She was something more, something her stepmother must have known. Perhaps that was why she was always mocked, always belittled, because the stepmother feared the day the curse would awaken. The thought struck her like lightning, and she trembled not with weakness but with realization. That night, as the village slept unaware, she sat in the darkness with her head bowed, her body frail, but her spirit stirring with new force. The whispers no longer frightened her. They were her inheritance, her secret weapon, the truth her enemies could never control. Alone in her despair, she understood that the curse was not a chain but a key, one that unlocked a door within her soul. What waited behind that door was vast and dangerous, but it was hers. When she finally closed her eyes, her lips curled into the faintest shadow of a smile. The curse was awake and so was she. By the time dawn broke, though nothing had changed on the surface, something irreversible had taken root in her heart. She was no longer the girl who bowed her head beneath cruelty. She was the vessel of a legacy that none could laugh at and soon none could break. The nights grew long and heavy, the air thick with secrets only she could hear. What began as faint whispers had grown into clear voices that carried both warning and guidance. They told her that the curse was not simply a burden, it was a legacy, one that could destroy her if left untamed, but could also raise her higher than any human if she learned to master it. She listened, afraid yet compelled, her heart racing every time the shadows deepened and the voices grew stronger. In the silence of her loneliness she began to respond, first with trembling whispers of her own, then with bold questions and finally with acceptance. Her teachers were unseen, but their presence wrapped around her like a cloak, teaching her things no mortal would dare to speak aloud. At first, the power terrified her. When she reached out her hand in anger, the flame of a lamp flickered and died. When she closed her eyes in grief, she could feel the heartbeats of those who mocked her, each one pounding like a drum in her skull. But the voices urged her not to run. They showed her how to steady her breath, how to silence her trembling hands, how to gather the storm that was trying to break loose inside her. Slowly, she began to shape the curse into something she could command. The ground beneath her feet no longer threatened to swallow her. Instead, it listened to her steps as though waiting for her will to guide it. Night after night, she trained in silence. The moon became her witness, casting silver light upon her as she moved with a grace that had never belonged to her before. She learned to walk unseen, her presence cloaked like a shadow slipping between walls. She learned to summon winds with a whisper, their strength bending branches and carrying secrets far. Her tears no longer fell uselessly to the ground. When they touched the earth, they sank like drops of fire, leaving the soil trembling. The curse was no longer a chain around her, it was a blade being sharpened with each passing night. Sometimes, the training left her broken, her body aching as though she had fought 100 battles in her sleep. She would wake with scratches on her skin, bruises across her arms, and the taste of blood in her mouth. But instead of fear, she felt pride. The pain was no longer from humiliation or cruelty, it was the pain of becoming. She was no longer a girl abandoned to tears, she was an apprentice of the shadows, guided by ancestors who demanded she rise where others had fallen. Meanwhile, her stepmother, blind in her arrogance, continued to laugh. She strutted about the village, boasting of her victory over the girl she called worthless. She encouraged the villagers to mock, to sneer, to scorn her even further, believing the girl broken beyond repair. But the stepmother's laughter only fueled the training. Each cruel word, each mocking smile became a spark that lit the fire in her veins. She would whisper her stepmother's name in the dark, and the shadows would echo it back, hissing, promising that the time of reckoning would come. Soon she began to test her new strength in secret. When a cruel villager raised his hand to strike her, the earth shifted beneath him, sending him stumbling into the mud. When another tried to steal her food, his hands trembled uncontrollably, spilling everything he touched. They laughed still, but there was unease now, a lingering sense that something unseen moved with her, that the girl they thought powerless was no longer the same. She hid her smile when she saw their discomfort. The shadows taught her patience. The time to reveal herself would come, but not yet. Her nights became rituals. She would sit at the edge of the forest, surrounded by silence, and call upon the voices. They taught her chants older than the village itself, words that burned her tongue yet gave her command over unseen forces. They showed her symbols to carve into the ground, circles that glowed faintly when touched by her blood. Each mark linked her closer to the curse, weaving it into her soul until it no longer felt foreign, it felt like destiny. She was not carrying the curse, she was becoming it. One night, the wind howled with unusual force and the voices grew urgent. "You are ready," they whispered. She felt her body tremble, not from fear but from the weight of their truth. She could feel the power humming beneath her skin, waiting to be unleashed. Her stepmother's laughter echoed in her memory, sharp and mocking, but it no longer pierced her heart. Instead it fueled her. The girl who once cried alone was gone. In her place stood something darker, sharper, and far more dangerous. She rose, her shadow stretching unnaturally long across the earth. The night bent around her, and even the stars seemed to dim. She no longer belonged to the village that scorned her. She belonged to something greater, something eternal. And though her stepmother knew nothing of it, the curse she had once laughed at now had a master. One who would soon return not with tears, but with power that no one could break. She returned before the first cockcrow, her steps soft upon the earth, her figure cloaked in the stillness of night. There was no fanfare, no announcement, only silence that seemed to travel with her like a veil. She had left the village as a girl broken by scorn, but the one who walked back was something other, calm, unshaken, and carrying within her a weight that made the air itself tremble. Her shadow stretched unnaturally behind her, long and dark, even though the moon was faint. The dogs that usually barked at strangers whimpered and crept into corners, their ears pressed flat. The wind itself hushed as if it dared not interrupt her passage. She had trained in silence, and in silence she now returned. At first, the villagers did not notice her arrival. They had gathered at the square, drinking palm wine and telling stories of their own importance, many of them echoing the cruel laughter of her stepmother who had become bold in her mockery. They spoke of the girl as if she were already forgotten, a shadow erased by ridicule. But then one by one their laughter began to falter. A few turned their heads as though a chill had touched the back of their necks. Others paused mid-sentence, unable to explain the sudden weight pressing on their chests. It was as if the night had grown thicker, heavier, swallowing sound and light. And then they saw her, standing at the edge of the gathering, quiet, her eyes calm yet shining with an unsettling clarity. She said nothing. Her silence spoke louder than any insult they had hurled before. They searched her face for weakness, for the familiar cracks of sorrow that once made her easy prey, but found none. Her expression was still, her lips neither curved nor trembling, her gaze steady enough to hold even the proudest of men in place. The calmness unnerved them more than rage would have. They had expected screams if she ever dared return, or perhaps a plea for mercy. But what they saw was a presence that needed no words. Mothers clutched their children closer without knowing why. The elders shifted uncomfortably, though none dared move away. Even the strongest of the hunters felt their throats dry, as though a storm was standing in front of them disguised in human form. The calmness of her face contrasted with the heaviness in the air, and the villagers felt something they had not felt in years, fear. And yet, above all others, her stepmother laughed. She threw back her head, her voice shrill, piercing the silence like a blade. "So, the wretched one returns?" she sneered, clapping her hands as though welcoming a fool to a stage. "Did you come back to give us more tears? Did you think your absence made you stronger? You are nothing. You always will be nothing." The villagers flinched at the sound of her voice as if it did not belong in that silence, but she was too blind, too arrogant to see what everyone else felt. The girl's eyes shifted toward her, slow and deliberate. No words passed her lips, but her gaze was enough to silence the murmurs that had begun to rise. It was not a look of anger nor one of sorrow, it was something deeper, something that carried both promise and warning. The stepmother felt it, though she fought against the sensation, forcing another laugh from her throat. But the laugh trembled slightly this time, cracked at its edges. She wrapped her pride around her like a cloak, refusing to let fear show, yet the weight of her stepdaughter's silence pressed upon her more heavily than any insult ever could. The villagers whispered now among themselves, though softly as though afraid the silence would devour their voices. "She has changed," one muttered. "Her eyes are not the same," said another. But no one dared step closer. They stood frozen, caught between curiosity and dread, waiting for something they could not name. The air smelled different, sharp and cold, though no wind moved. The torches flickered, dimming as if refusing to burn brightly in her presence. The girl moved then, just a single step forward, and the ground seemed to sigh beneath her feet. The crowd instinctively drew back, though none had been touched. She did not rush, she did not shout. Her calmness was the very thing that broke them. They realized now that the silence was not emptiness, it was control. She had mastered something beyond them, something that commanded even the night. Still, her stepmother laughed again, louder, desperate to cover the unease gnawing at her chest. "You think standing here quietly makes you powerful? You think these villagers fear you? They laugh at you, girl. Just as I do." Her words scraped the air, but they felt weak against the immovable calm of the one she mocked. The girl said nothing. She did not need to. Every heartbeat in the square seemed to answer for her, pounding harder, faster, as though the entire village's blood had fallen into rhythm with hers. The silence grew unbearable, pressing upon them until their breaths came shallow. And then for the first time the stepmother faltered. Her voice cracked mid-laugh and her hand, which had once pointed mockingly, dropped slightly to her side. She felt a shiver crawl up her spine but forced herself to smile, clinging to her arrogance like a drowning woman clings to a floating stick. The girl stood there, calm as the earth, terrifying as the storm. She had not spoken a single word, yet the village was already divided, those who still clung to laughter, and those who bowed inwardly to the power they did not understand. What none of them yet knew, but all began to sense, was that the silence of her return was only the beginning. The silence that had carried her back into the village could no longer hold what burned inside her. The moment stretched, heavy and unbearable, as the girl's eyes swept across those who had mocked her, those who had laughed at her pain, and those who had pretended innocence while feeding on cruelty. Then, with a breath that felt more like a storm breaking than air itself, the curse within her stirred, rising like a tide that had waited too long. Her body did not convulse, nor did she scream. Instead, her calmness shattered into something deeper, an unleashing that belonged not to a girl, but to the weight of generations, to spirits who had never forgotten the truth. The earth trembled beneath their feet. It was slight at first, a shiver through the soil, but then it grew until even the most stubborn men felt their legs weaken. The torches flickered violently, shadows jerking across faces that suddenly looked pale and hollow. Crops stored in the granaries began to rot in their baskets, green turning black before the villagers' eyes, the air thickening with the sharp stench of decay. Mothers gasped, pulling children into their arms, but no distance was safe. The curse was not a weapon she threw outward. It poured like smoke into every corner of the village, pressing against every chest, seeping into every lie. Those who had lied most boldly felt it first. A man who had once sworn he never joined in mocking her clutched his throat, choking as words of truth burst out against his will. "I laughed," he cried, his voice ragged and broken. "I laughed at her tears. I said she was nothing." His wife turned away in shame, but she too could not hide. The curse clawed at her tongue until she confessed how she had joined the stepmother's taunts, teaching her own children to spit at the girl. The truth spilled out, one confession after another, and the square filled with a chorus of guilt and trembling voices. The villagers who had once found strength in numbers now found themselves isolated, each laid bare by a force greater than pride. They looked around wildly, hoping for denial, but every face betrayed the same terror. Secrets unraveled like loose threads, and the more they tried to hold them in, the faster they burned. The curse moved not as chaos but with purpose, stripping away pretense, tearing through false smiles, leaving behind only the rawness of their cruelty. Her stepmother laughed again, but this time the laugh cracked like dry wood in a fire. Her lips curled, her eyes wide with forced defiance, but the sound rang hollow. She tried to raise her voice above the fear, tried to mock as she always had, but her throat betrayed her. The laugh ended in a cough, harsh and ugly, her words choking before they could form. She staggered, her hand clawing at the air as though she could push away the heaviness that wrapped itself around her. The girl did not move toward her, did not raise her hands, did not speak, but the curse moved on its own, as if the very earth had chosen to answer the years of cruelty. Around them, fields outside the village groaned with the sound of dying crops. Stalks of millet bent and snapped, yam vines shriveled in the soil and fruit blackened on the trees. The villagers screamed, some dropping to their knees, begging the girl for mercy, others clutching their children and wailing that hunger would follow this night. Yet in the midst of ruin she stood untouched, her figure calm, her presence burning brighter than the fires in their torches. The curse did not harm her, it fed from her, shielded her, made her the center of its storm. Fear spread through the village like fire racing across dry grass. Men who had once stood tall now trembled, their bravado turned to ashes. Women who had once joined in laughter sobbed openly, their faces streaked with tears of regret. The children, too young to understand the depths of cruelty, huddled close to their mothers, their wide eyes reflecting the strange glow in the girl's. She did not speak, but every gaze she cast was a sentence, every silence a judgment. Then, as if the curse had waited for this moment, the stepmother's mask cracked completely. Her body shook as though unseen hands had grasped her shoulders. She opened her mouth to shout defiance, but instead of words, a long, broken scream tore free, echoing against the huts. She stumbled backward, her eyes wild, her laughter gone. "This is trickery," she tried to cry, but her voice splintered. The curse clung to her like smoke, wrapping itself around her head, her chest, her arms, until she looked less like a proud woman and more like a shadow unraveling. The villagers drew back from her, horrified, no longer seeing a leader but the root of their shared shame. The girl's silence remained, but it was no longer emptiness. It was command. She had unleashed the curse not only to punish but to reveal, to show them what they had buried, to scorch away the illusions of strength and authority. Crops could be replanted, but the truths now revealed could not be hidden again. Every villager had seen their own weakness reflected back at them, and no laugh could ever cover it. As the night stretched on, the weight of her curse did not lift. The fear lingered, seeping into their bones, a reminder that the girl they had mocked was no longer bound by their ridicule. They had made her the vessel of their cruelty, but she had returned as something none of them could break. Their false smiles were gone, their pride burned away, and all that remained was awe and terror, at the curse that walked among them in human form. The laughter that had once rolled so easily from the stepmother's lips was gone. In its place came a dry rasp, the sound of someone choking on their own fear. The curse that the girl had unleashed moved with precision, as though it had always known its first victim. It did not scatter itself wildly through the village. It circled, coiled, and then struck at the one who had been the root of all the cruelty. The stepmother staggered as though an invisible weight pressed down on her shoulders, forcing her proud spine to bend. The villagers who had once flocked to her side, eager to echo her mockery, now drew away, their faces pale, their eyes wide, unwilling to be near her as the curse began to unravel her piece by piece. She opened her mouth to speak, to command, to reclaim even a shred of her authority, but the words that emerged were not hers. They came out twisted, trembling confessions that betrayed her. I mocked her. I starved her. I wanted her gone. Her eyes widened with horror as if she had not meant to say it, as if the curse had reached down her throat and dragged out the truth she had buried. Each word landed heavy in the ears of the villagers, peeling away the false mask she had worn for years. The people who once respected her, who feared her sharp tongue and hard gaze, now saw only a woman exposed. Her body shook violently, her arms jerking as though bound by unseen ropes. The proud jewelry she wore clattered to the ground, her bracelets snapping, her necklace chain breaking. Symbols of her status, once displayed proudly before the village, lay scattered in the dirt like discarded scraps. She reached for them desperately, trying to grasp what she had lost, but the curse tightened, twisting her fingers until she cried out in pain. She had laughed at another's tears, now her own rolled hot and fast down her cheeks. The villagers, huddled together, began whispering among themselves. Some looked away, ashamed of how quickly they had followed her in cruelty. Others watched with grim satisfaction, remembering moments when her mockery had cut them too. Her authority was dissolving before their eyes, and no one lifted a hand to stop it. Fear kept them rooted in place, but so did a new realization. The stepmother's reign of power had never truly been strength. It had been built on cruelty, lies, and borrowed loyalty. And now all of it was crumbling. The stepmother tried once more to steady herself, to call the girl's name with derision, but her tongue faltered. The curse forced her to stammer, her words twisting into pleas instead of commands. Forgive me, no, she is nothing, no, please, mercy. Her contradictions exposed her desperation. Her dignity, once the armor she wore so fiercely, fell away, leaving her raw and trembling in front of those she had once ruled. The villagers' eyes no longer shone with admiration or fear, they glared with contempt. She was no longer the towering figure of dominance, but a caged bird beating its wings against invisible bars. The girl did not touch her. She did not even speak. She only stood there, her eyes sharp, her silence unbroken, and it was enough to deepen the stepmother's collapse. That silence carried the weight of every cruelty endured, every humiliation survived. It pressed down harder than any scream. The stepmother began to shrink, not in body but in presence. Her voice cracked. Her gaze darted from face to face, finding no ally. The villagers she had once commanded now stood as her judges, their expressions carved in stone. Then the curse showed its full cruelty. The stepmother's voice, once sharp and mocking, faltered entirely. She tried to laugh again but no sound came. Her lips moved but only silence spilled out. The curse had stripped her of her final weapon, her ability to sneer, to belittle, to wound with words. She clutched her throat, horror twisting her features, her wide eyes meeting the girl's as if to beg, but the girl remained unmoved. Where once she had been the victim of that voice, now she watched it dissolve into nothingness. The final blow came not from pain but from the people. One by one the villagers turned their backs on the stepmother. The same people who had once echoed her laughter now denied her completely, refusing to meet her gaze, refusing to hear her. A leader without followers, a voice without sound, a figure without dignity, the stepmother was undone. She crumpled to the ground, her hands digging into the dirt, her body trembling like a leaf in the wind. The curse had done what no human hand could. It stripped her of authority, dignity, and strength. She was no longer the stepmother who had laughed. She was a husk, a woman broken by her own cruelty and exposed by the very child she had mocked. And as she knelt in the dirt, trembling and voiceless, the village saw with perfect clarity that her reign was over, not just in power but in spirit. The curse did not end with the stepmother's fall. It lingered in the air, heavy and unyielding, clinging to every wall, every tree, every breath the villagers drew. At first they thought it could be resisted. The elders gathered, muttering ancient prayers, their voices trembling as they tried to recall rituals meant to banish evil. They lit fires and circled them, sprinkling herbs, invoking names of old spirits. But the flames sputtered strangely, bending toward the girl as if she were the true source of their strength. The herbs shriveled in their hands before they even touched the flames. The words of their chants twisted back on their tongues, turning into silence. Fear crept into their eyes, for it became clear that no spell could undo what had taken root. The warriors tried next. They sharpened their spears, strung their bows, and stood with trembling hands before the girl. Her presence unsettled them, but they still believed brute strength could restore the order they had always known. They advanced, their shadows long in the torchlight, but as they neared her, their bodies faltered. The ground beneath them softened into mud, swallowing their steps, making each stride heavier than the last. Their spears cracked like dry branches, their arrows turned in mid-flight, clattering uselessly at their feet. They looked at one another in horror, realizing the weapons they had trusted all their lives meant nothing before the curse. Then the mothers of the village stepped forward, clutching charms of protection around their children's necks. They thought love could shield them, thought prayers whispered in trembling voices could wrap their families in safety. But the charms crumbled into dust the moment they lifted them, leaving the children wide-eyed, staring at the girl who now seemed larger than life. Their mothers pulled them close, but even in the safety of their arms the children could not look away. They saw something in her they could not name, terrifying, yet also strangely mesmerizing. It was as though she had become the living law of the village itself, the center around which everything else now spun. The elders, warriors, and mothers fell silent together, their efforts dissolved into futility. Whispers spread through the crowd, whispers that tasted of both dread and awe. "It cannot be broken," they said. "The curse has chosen her." And indeed it had. The power was no longer just around her, it was in her, through her, bound to her soul so tightly that no force could sever it. She stood there, calm, untouched, her very stillness more powerful than their frantic resistance. What unsettled them most was not only that they could not break the curse, but that they could no longer separate it from the girl herself. It was not a shadow clinging to her, not a storm hovering above her, it was her. Her presence carried it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, rolled through the air like thunder, every word a decree etched into the hearts of those who heard. No one dared interrupt. No one dared breathe too loudly. She was no longer the girl mocked, beaten, or silenced. She was something beyond human cruelty, beyond human control. From that day forward the village changed. Fires burned differently, bending toward her when she passed. The air felt heavier when she walked among them, a reminder that the curse was woven into the very fabric of their world now. Crops bowed under her gaze, either flourishing or withering depending on her unspoken will. Rivers seemed to swell louder when she stood by their banks. The people came to realize that their lives were no longer governed by the laws they had always known, but by the silent, unbreakable presence of the girl they had once ridiculed. Some tried to flee, believing distance might grant them freedom. They packed what they could and slipped into the night, but none returned. Whispers grew of strange happenings beyond the borders of the village, shadows that stalked those who left, voices that led them astray, paths that turned back on themselves until they stumbled once more into the village they had abandoned. The curse did not allow escape. It bound not only the people but the land itself, knitting everything together under her unseen command. At last the clan stopped resisting. They bowed their heads, not in loyalty at first but in raw fear. Yet as days passed, that fear deepened into something else, recognition. They began to understand that the girl was no longer a victim, no longer the child mocked and starved. She was untouchable, a figure who stood beyond punishment, beyond ridicule, beyond even revenge. Her power was not borrowed from spirits alone, it had fused with her being, making her the living embodiment of the curse. No elder, no warrior, no mother, no spirit of the past could undo it. She had become the law, the warning, the shadow, and the flame. And as the villagers moved quietly through their days, always aware of her presence, they came to accept that what had once been their cruelty had birthed something eternal. The curse would never be broken, for it no longer existed outside of her. It was her. The story of the girl, once drowned in mockery and humiliation, did not fade with her rise. It grew stronger with each telling, etched into the memory of the land and the whispers of the people. Where once laughter had been used as a weapon against her, it was now remembered as the very spark that brought forth a curse no one could escape. The villagers spoke of her in hushed tones, their voices low even in the warmth of firesides, for to laugh at another's pain was no longer just cruel, it was dangerous. They told their children, "Be careful whom you mock, for a curse may sleep in their silence." And so the tale of the girl who once shed silent tears became a warning wrapped in awe, a legend that would outlive even those who had seen it unfold. The stepmother, who had laughed the loudest, became the centerpiece of the tale. Her fall was recited again and again, a reminder that arrogance and cruelty are always answered, if not by men, then by forces greater than them. Some said her laughter echoed still, but twisted into cries carried by the wind at night, a reminder of how the curse had stripped her of her pride. Others claimed her shadow lingered in the corners of the huts, restless and afraid, forever paying for the cruelty she had once celebrated. In every version of the story, the stepmother was reduced to nothing, a living embodiment of the warning: no one can laugh at suffering without consequence. The girl, however, was remembered not as a victim, but as a force of destiny. Where once she was mocked for being weak, she was now revered, feared, and admired as the embodiment of power. Her image became one of both beauty and dread, her silent tears remembered as the seeds of her strength, her quiet return as the dawning of a storm. The curse was not merely her weapon but her crown, for it made her untouchable, weaving her spirit into the very soil and skies of the village. Some said the rains that fell in times of drought were her doing, others believed the sickness that struck the arrogant was her warning. She became the unseen master of the place, her power felt long after her footsteps had vanished from the earth. Generations later, when the young asked about laughter, their elders would pause. Smiles were safe, but cruel laughter carried a memory too heavy to risk. "Do not laugh at another's wounds," the elders would say, for once a girl was mocked and she returned with a curse that silenced every laugh forever. And the children, wide-eyed, would huddle closer to the fire, imagining her silent tears, her quiet training in the shadows, and the day she walked back into the village, no longer a girl but something greater. Thus her story was not just a tale of vengeance but of transformation, of how pain can shape power, and how silence can carry a force more terrifying than the loudest voice. She was remembered as the girl who turned sorrow into strength, who transformed laughter into fear, and whose curse became a law stronger than any man could enforce. Her legend lingered in every corner of the village, in every whispered warning and in every cautious smile. And so the girl who once wept alone in the night became immortal in memory. The village that had mocked her now carried her story like a weight on its back, knowing that their cruelty had birthed the very power that ruled them. She was no longer simply a girl, nor even just a cursed woman. She was legend itself, the unbroken spirit who silenced every laugh forever.